On March 1st, 1954, at 6:14 a.m., the sun rose in the east over the North Pacific Ocean, beginning a balmy spring day with temperatures already reaching around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The water sparkled as the first soft rays of light danced across the peaks of small waves. Seabirds called out to one another, summoning the flock to feast on the first meal of the day, found in schools of fish swirling just under the ocean's surface. And villagers, indigenous to the thousands of small landmasses comprising the network of the Marshall Islands, stepped out from their simple homes with a probable yawn or two, ready to begin a hard day's work of farming, fishing, and raising livestock for their community. Then, at 6:45 a.m., a second sun rose in the west. This was the Castle Bravo nuclear disaster, a true horror in history. Following the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan's surrender, and the subsequent end to World War II in 1945, the United States began testing newly designed nuclear weapons in 1946 off the island of Bikini Atoll. At the same time, the Soviet Union had drastically picked up the pace of their own nuclear weapon research and development, successfully creating their first nuclear chain reaction in December 1946, as the Cold War was entering its first phase. While the U.S. closely watched the Soviet Union's burgeoning atomic progress, they struck a deal with the United Nations in July 1947, entering into a territorial trusteeship called the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. This gave the U.S. full precedent to conduct further nuclear testing in the North Pacific region. In the years that followed, the U.S. would conduct dozens of atmospheric nuclear detonations in what came to be known as the Pacific Proving Grounds. In late 1952, the U.S. was involved in an early series of tests codenamed Operation Ivy, wherein the concept of fusion-fueled thermonuclear reaction was first explored. The results of the tests were a success, when on November 1, 1952, on the Eniwetok Atoll, a 10.4 megaton explosion took place, originating from a device dubbed Ivy Mike. Fast forward to March 1954, the U.S. had now entered into Operation Castle. Considering the positive and negative takeaways of Operation Ivy, the U.S. realized they needed a bomb that generated a nuclear reaction from a dry fuel, rather than a liquid fuel like Ivy Mike's, thus reducing its overall size and weight, making it more conducive for air delivery and easier to mass produce in quantity, while also still retaining enough energy to generate a satisfactory explosive yield. This dry fuel was found in lithium deuteride, or lithium-6. A solid at room temperature, lithium-6 was known to play a large part in producing tritium, a crucial component for nuclear reactions in the Operation Castle devices that were developed. The first bomb to be tested as part of the operation was Castle Bravo. Coming in at a relatively light payload of 23,500 pounds, and being roughly 15 feet long and 4.5 feet wide, it would be the first dry fuel bomb tested by the U.S. Lithium-6 made up 37 to 40% of the fuel, while lithium-7 acted as a filler, comprising the rest of the lithium supply. Thought to be a relatively inert and inconsequential isotope when it came to the nuclear reaction, it was expected that lithium-6, not 7, would do the heavy lifting in creating the essential tritium for the bomb to perform as designed. With this fuel ratio, Castle Bravo was predicted to have a 6 megaton blast, with actual yield being somewhere between 4 to 8 megatons. What Operation Castle's team did not know was that lithium-7 would play a much greater role than expected. Castle Bravo, or the Shrimp, as it was called, was scheduled for detonation on March 1st, 1954 on Bikini Atoll. The Shrimp was set and in place inside a large metal hangar established on an artificial island built atop a coral reef just off the coast of Bikini. The bomb was surrounded by intricate diagnostic and monitoring devices, including high-speed cameras. Bomb test personnel took their positions aboard naval ships and inside observation bunkers. At 6:45 a.m., A thermonuclear reaction was triggered, and the Castle Bravo test was underway. First, a blinding light, so bright that test personnel either wore special protective goggles or simply looked away in order to avoid damage to their retinas. Hundreds of miles away, some native Marshallese villagers saw it, completely oblivious to the tests the U.S. military was conducting in their region. Even at this distance, some experienced temporary vision loss. From their perspective, it may have seemed as though the world was ending. Within that first second following detonation, a fireball rose, 4.5 miles wide, and was visible over 250 miles away on another atoll. Within 1 minute, the mushroom cloud had reached a distance of 47,000 feet and a diameter of 7 miles. On the island of Rongelap, 100 miles east from Bikini, the blast was heard as a very loud boom that made the ground shake a few minutes later. Within 10 minutes of the detonation, the mushroom cloud continued to rise and expand, reaching 100,000 feet as it neared the stratosphere. The coral reef the artificial island was built atop was obliterated, and Bravo gouged a crater in the ocean floor over a mile in diameter with a depth of 250 feet. Whereas theoretical physicist J. Carson Mark thought that Bravo could potentially exceed its predicted 6 megaton yield by 20%, Bravo eclipsed that figure, erupting in a 15 megaton blast, or 1,000 times more powerful than that of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. And even with all this awe-inspiring yet terrifying power the bomb unleashed, it would be the least of everyone's worries. It had been forecast by weather observers that winds would be favorable on the day of Castle Bravo's test. Scientists at Los Alamos knew that radioactive fallout would be a consequence following Bravo's detonation. In fact, these earlier nuclear bomb designs were some of the dirtiest created, as the kinks were still being ironed out as far as efficiency was concerned when it came to the nuclear reactions being triggered. On the date of the test, an unexpected wind shear shifted away from the uninhabited northern region of the Marshall Islands and took a more southeastern direction, putting a number of inhabited islands in the path of nuclear fallout. Even the test personnel, strategically placed many miles from Bikini and observing from protected bunkers, needed to abandon their posts for better shelter. While many figures of the U.S. military and scientific community involved would be overexposed to radiation from Bravo, most were quickly evacuated and promptly treated. Unfortunately for the native Marshallese, this was not the case. The inhabited atolls of Rongerik, Rongelap, Alingane, and Uterik were all heavily irradiated by Bravo. On the island of Rongelap, a few hours after villagers had seen the fireball and felt the seismic activity from the explosion, a strange, multicolored dust began to drift down upon the beaches and homes. Unaware of the test, people were mesmerized by it, some trying to catch it in their hands. Children even played in it, likening it to snow. While evacuations of the exposed test personnel were carried out within 35 hours, it would take up to 3 days before the U.S. would reach the irradiated islands, where many of the inhabitants were already suffering from acute radiation sickness, their hair beginning to fall out, in addition to others sustaining severe radiation burns and other symptoms. The contaminated atolls were evacuated, with promises made by the U.S. that resettlement would occur once the radiation had cleared. The safety exclusion zone around Bikini Atoll was increased to 570,000 square miles. For context, this is comparable to around 1% of the Earth's entire landmass. While Castle Bravo's devastating explosive yield and terrible contamination of populated, indigenous lands of the region were enough for all involved to take pause over the situation, a silent tragedy was occurring in tandem with the one already unfolding. Unbeknownst to the U.S. military, a small Japanese fishing boat named the Fifth Lucky Dragon was operating near the area of the Castle Bravo test. Fishing for tuna, the boat slipped under the radar and was not picked up by spotters, as it was just outside the established danger zone of expected impact from the blast. However, given that Castle Bravo overperformed and the winds had shifted, the Fifth Lucky Dragon was also blanketed with radiation. As the 23 crew members aboard went about their duties on March 1st, they noticed the horizon to the west light up as if the sun was already setting. They heard the blast, being only 80 miles east of Ground Zero. A few hours later, they noticed a gray, mist-like substance settling over their ship. These were the remnants of radioactive coral and sand that had been pulverized by the bomb. Alarmed, they decided to leave the area, but needed to haul in their catch still on the lines, which took them hours to do. In that time, radioactive ash got in their noses, ears, eyes, mouths, and under their clothes. They deposited the piles of ash accumulating on the deck into bags, using their bare hands. Later that evening, all on board began to experience headaches, nausea, dizziness, and diarrhea. For all the misery the mysterious substance was causing them, they began to refer to it as death ash. When the ship finally docked in Japan, almost 2 weeks later, it was behind schedule. The sickly crew checked into the Yaizu Public Hospital. The following day, several crewmen were sent to Tokyo University Hospital for further diagnosis and treatment. A Japanese biophysicist arrived at the hospital to examine the crew members. It didn't take long for him to conclude that the men were suffering from acute radiation syndrome. The 5th Lucky Dragon crew were then quarantined at the Tokyo University Hospital, where they would remain undergoing 14 grueling months of treatment to remove the radiation from their bodies. All but one of the crew members would ultimately survive their excruciating ordeal. A radioman, Ikeiichi Kubiyama, passed away September 23, 1954, from complications stemming from his condition. And even though the remaining crew members would eventually recover from their initial illness, many went on to have lifelong medical issues and would suffer premature deaths due to various cancers. During the shocking incident of the 5th Lucky Dragon, news about their condition and the preceding events of the Bravo test not only spread across Japan, but the entire world, as headlines filled newspapers with the outrageous story of the Japanese fishermen who were left at the mercy of U.S. nuclear testing. Following the revelation of the disaster that befell the Japanese fishing crew, and the resulting discovery of their catch also being highly irradiated, panic began to ensue through the international community. Multiple countries banned fishing imports from Japan, as the Japanese government called for testing on any fish caught within a 2,500-kilometer radius of the test site, while lashing out at the U.S. for yet another nuclear tragedy just a few years following the atomic bombings of World War II. During the coverage of the Japanese fishing boat incident, along with the now not-so-secret bomb tests the U.S. was conducting out in the North Pacific, further media reports went on to describe how the bomb's debris cloud rose so high it had entered the stratosphere, suggesting that the radioactive pollution would traverse the entire globe, convincing many to believe that everyone was now at risk of radiation poisoning. Despite the radiological disaster that took place on the inhabited islands and the Japanese fishing vessel near the U.S. test site of Bikini, 6 more thermonuclear bomb tests would be conducted in the area following Castle Bravo, each with yields of up to 10 megatons. The incident with the 5th Lucky Dragon would go on to influence the formation of an anti-American and anti-nuclear movement in Japan, resulting in the call for limiting or outright banning the testing of nuclear weapons. For the indigenous Marshallese inhabitants of the polluted atolls that were blanketed in Bravo's fallout, they were assured of prompt resettlement once the radiation had cleared, and would remain displaced refugees until that time. Nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands finally concluded in 1958 after the U.S. had detonated a total of 67 nuclear bombs. Nearly 70 years since the Castle Bravo disaster, Bikini Atoll, along with the Rongelap Atoll, both remain uninhabitable from the radiation left over from Bravo and other tests. Some inhabitants returned to Rongelap in 1957 at the encouragement of the U.S. government, who had more sinister, ulterior motives of studying the effects of diminished radiation on human beings. The people of Rongelap soon fled again in 1985 over validated concerns of dangerous radiation levels, requiring help from Greenpeace for evacuation as the U.S. refused. The U.S. allowed residents of Bikini to return in the early 1970s, but they too evacuated once again, after readings showed unsafe levels of radiation in the food the inhabitants had grown in the contaminated soil. Today, families are still displaced from their islands at Bikini and Rongelap, since the U.S. originally evacuated them in 1946. And although the U.S. has worked with the Marshallese government in the cleanup and decontamination of the islands, those efforts have largely fallen short. In Japan, the The fifth Lucky Dragon sat in a refuse heap up until 1970, before it was reclaimed, decontaminated, and deemed safe for public display. Its short-lived resting place was converted into a park, where the ship can now be viewed within its very own museum in Tokyo, a symbol of disdain and condemnation over the use of nuclear weapons, but also a memorial to remember the 23 crew members who bore the brunt of Bravo's catastrophic effects. In May 1955, after continued public denunciation of nuclear weapons testing over the concern of environmental and genetic damage caused by the resulting fallout, the United Nations Disarmament Committee was established and convened for their first meeting, attended by the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and the Soviet Union. 8 long years would ensue over deliberations for a nuclear test ban, given the complex nature of the involved nation's security concerns, along with the ever-changing international relationships during the Cold War. Although finally, on September 24, 1963, the test ban treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate and went into effect on October 10th of the same year. The Castle Bravo test is a stark reminder from the past of how horribly wrong the very use of nuclear weapons is, even in an experimental scenario, though not excluding the atrocities that were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The reckless testing of the bombs during the atomic age and the toxic remnants they left behind demonstrate how inconceivable it is to even warrant a sliver of justification for their existence. As we all have experienced early in 2022, as Russia escalated its nuclear forces to DEFCON 3 over the ongoing war in Ukraine, the prospect of staring down imminent nuclear conflict can be quite hair-raising. All anyone needs to do is look back in time to the genesis of the atom bomb, where so many lives were needlessly lost in Japan, and to the negligent tragedy that played out in the Marshall Islands, following the world's introduction to thermonuclear destruction, where innocent, unsuspecting people were subjected to one of the worst designs of death and suffering humanity has ever devised. Look back and see the futility of such self-destructive power and the unforgiving misery and hopelessness that follows. The same misery and hopelessness resulting from the Castle Bravo nuclear disaster, making it a true horror in history. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.